This is going to be a little bit of an experiment, so bear with me. So I have a story for you today, and in the spirit of our center, I'm taking the liberty of having a discussion from the place of convergence of different wisdom traditions, because the story I brought with me doesn't come from Zen sources. It's a Sufi story. But before we get to the story, I want to contextualize it in the talks that we've had before. And last week, when Christine Dussel was speaking, one of the issues that came up is, what does right action mean when you're talking not just about your own personal enlightenment, but you're talking about right action in the context of collective action and social action? And Christine talked about patience and flexibility. So the questions came up, what does that mean in situations where we are often prone to impatience, where we feel we know what should happen and we want to make it happen, but things don't quite happen the way we want them to. And so what does knowing and not knowing mean in that context? So I wanted to bring you this story because I feel it's helped me grapple with those questions. But in approaching it, I want you to think about the 4 Bodhisattva vows. Creations are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to open them. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. And also, since we've been reading Bernie Glassman's The Infinite Circle, I invite you to consider also his interpretation of the 3 treasures and the 3 tenets as he brought them into the Zen peacemaker order. For the 3 treasures, he says, oneness, the awakened nature of all beings; diversity, the ocean of wisdom and compassion; and harmony, the interdependence of all creations. And the way he phrases the 3 tenets in this context is not knowing, thereby giving up fixed ideas about myself and the universe; bearing witness to the joy and the suffering of the world; and taking loving action. And that's a central question, right? How do we take loving action? What does that mean for us? And so the way I'd like to approach this story, as I said, this is something of an experiment. So what I would like to ask those of you who are willing to do is that we're going to read the story. Everybody take a paragraph. So I'll pass the mic, and then you can pass the mic between yourself. And I'll embody the story, because there is wisdom in embodiment, and it helps me at any rate. So let's try it.
The Sufi story of fire, a story about leading change. In ancient times, a man named Nur, light, discovered how to make fire. He traveled to various places and shared his discovery to 5 tribes of people. They all had different reactions to him. Some embraced his discovery. and others regarded him with aversion and fear. And eventually, he was killed.
Generations later, a master and his disciples were traveling in the lands where these tribes lived. By this time, each of the 5 tribes had a unique viewpoint towards Noor and the fire making, and these subjects accounted for a major part of each tribe's cultural and religious practices. After observing the tribes, the disciples said to each other, "It is very surprising to see how greatly in the way they regard fire making and Noor. Let us visit the tribes and tell them the truth about fire making. They will be educated and their lives can be better."
So the traveling master and disciples went to the first tribe, where fire was a secret used amongst the priest class. One of the traveling disciples said, "I can't duplicate the fire-making that you people regard as divine and restricted only to the priests. If I do this, will you admit that you have been wrong for all these years?" When the priests heard this, they immediately shouted out, "These travelers are heretics! Seize them and take them away at once!" They seized the one disciple, but the others escaped.
The remaining travelers moved on to the second tribe, where fire-making tools were worshipped, but were not used to make fire. A second traveling disciple announced to the tribe, "I come here to inform you that you are worshipping these tools, yet you are unaware that their use is simply to make fire." The people heard this and responded, "We are hospitable people and welcome you to our land. But we must inform you that you are a stranger to our customs, and you do not understand what we are doing. Hence, we will not listen to you."
So the traveler went to the third tribe. This one worshipped Noor with statues and ceremonies. The disciples approached the tribe's leaders and said, "The Noor that you worship is actually just a person like the rest of us." He discovered a fire-making skill that you can learn and use. The tribe leaders replied, "Even if that is true, such knowledge is reserved only for a select few like us, not for the entire community to know. We do not want what you are offering."
So the travelers left and went to the fourth tribe, where fire-making and Noor were legendary folklore that some people believed and others didn't. One of the travelers announced to the tribe, "The fire-making stories and legends you speak of are indeed true, and I can show you how to make fire." This announcement caused much division among the tribe. Among them, some people desired to learn how to make fire from the travelers, but were only concerned with using it to take advantage of others. Another group of people said, "These travelers are duping us and trying to take advantage of us, and we will have nothing to do with them." And another group of people said, "Whether these travelers speak the truth or not, we do not want to hear from them. We prefer to retain our current legends as they are, which forms the foundation of our culture and community."
So the travelers left and went to the fifth tribe, where they used fire throughout their community for useful purposes. The travelers then said to their master, "What are we to make of all of this? We tried to teach the 4 other tribes to make fire and use it the way this tribe does, but our efforts have gone in vain."
So the master replied, "So as you have observed, though most people have the capacity to learn, this is not enough to accomplish what you and nor wish to. What has happened dependently arises from what they collectively imagine to be learned from their own stories, not from what you think they first need to learn. Understand this, and then perhaps you will find the proper way to teach. So tell me, seekers, what have you learned from this story?"
So tell me, seekers. So before you answer the question, though, what you have learned from the story, what I want to know first is, does the story resonate with you? Have you had parallels to the story in your own experience?
I can say I've had multiple careers, and in every career there's a parallel to this story. I still haven't figured out the answer yet.
You want to say something about situations you've been in?
Not really, no. There's always a lesson to be learned, and I've learned many.
I'm thinking a bit about child rearing and how often our children don't really, although we tell them and tell them, they really learn it on their own.
Well, you know the songs from the Fantastics?
Go. Which one?
Why did the kids put beans in their ears?
Oh, yes.
Because we said no.
That's right.
And plant a radish, get a radish, never any doubt. But with children, it's bewildering. Whatever you think you've got, it's what they're not. Yeah. Anybody else have comments on situations you've run into that you think are parallel to the story? And situations where you may have felt the same impatience and distress that the disciples felt in the story. I know for me, I've felt that a lot. Working as an evaluator on programs where, I was supposed to come up with recommendations, but people didn't always follow them, or sometimes it was hard to figure out what was going to work. Okay, so now I want to go to the more general question of, in thinking about the story, what did it make you think about? Did it prompt any kind of insights on your part?
The thing that interested me about this story is that it supposes that there's a group of disciples who know the real truth, and everybody else is befuddled. I put myself in the befuddled camp, so I identify with one of those groups. I don't know which one, and I don't know if that's. I don't know what it's like to be in the group that knows the truth. I don't know if any of us do.
If I could follow up on that, it's like we all think we know the answer, but we're all, blindly putting our feet in the fire without knowing it. And, you can try and lead the horse to the water, but he won't drink. And, you come into these situations all the time in your life, whether it's at home or at work or at play, and, you just, it's difficult when you're grasping at wanting the change. Okay, so that syncs with the idea of not knowing,
right? Like what you said. But one of the things the story talks about is the disciples observing or witnessing. So I wondered if anybody has any thoughts about that, about whether there are more or less effective ways of witnessing and what that might mean.
Probably toward the middle of the story, I started thinking about our current political situation and the, forget the wall, just the children. And frame your question again. I lost what I wanted, exactly how I wanted to say that.
I was saying, that the disciples were observing.
Oh, yeah.
And what does that mean about witnessing?
Yeah, so I am bearing witness, not physically at that site, but I personally am bearing witness to what I consider a horror going on. And I would love to find a way to make that truth so obvious that there's no question that those children are released and their families are put together, but it's not happening.
And why do you think it's not happening?
Because everybody doesn't see the story the same way. Unfortunately. Because I'm right.
Yes, anybody else?
Well, what I thought of was the incident in Washington, D.C. with the students from, I believe it was Covington. That right away, because then I read two different viewpoints about that particular situation, editorials in one of the local newspapers, and it was really interesting how each person looked at that differently. One writer, which I have read quite a few of his comments and so on in the paper editorials, and he talked about when he was a 16-year-old and how the kinds of things that he did, how he was raised, and what he was being taught, and now as an adult, he's totally different. So he was kind of saying, well, give these kids a break. And then the other person that I read, totally different. These kids have been learning this for a long time. They're in a certain situation. These are the way they're being taught, and so on and so forth. So I have not watched the video of the incident, so I can't really, voice an opinion right now. But it was just interesting reading other people's viewpoints on that particular incident.
Yeah, so when you were talking about being taught, so one of the themes that keeps coming up in the story is, what is teaching, what is learning. And one of the things I like about the story is that it puts that in a social context. What does it mean to learn in a community? What does a community learn or not learn? And what does that mean for social divisions? So I wondered if anybody has any thoughts along those lines.
I think to understand people, you have to, or to have compassion or any understanding of the way they live, you have to live with them and like them. I think that's what the master was saying. Don't judge. Just try and put yourself in their position.
Well, for those of you who don't know, I'm a cultural anthropologist. So, and, part of my training was participant observation, which is what you were talking about. Which does converge with Bernie Glassman's teachings as well. His street retreats are certainly a form of participant observation. And and run into the same conundrums that researchers face when they're participant observers, because we're still not quite actually in and part of the community that we're participating with and observing the same way that people who were brought up in it are. But, I think in the story, the master is trying to coach his disciples to witness and to think about what is the situation like from the community member's point of view, or multiple points of view, because there can be, it's not like all the communities were homogenous or unified, right? Some of them had sub-communities and divisions within themselves. And the story touches on some, pretty complex points about power too, right? And knowledge and power, and what the connections are between, in social anthropological parlance, the connections between social organization and cultural models. And I should tell you that so I was given this story by an anthropological colleague of mine, Michael Lieber, and one of the things that interested him in the story is what it says about culture. And because in observing the 5 different communities, the disciples see, 5 different ways of dealing with fire and the knowledge around fire. And even though the same person originally, Nur, came and tried to teach them all how to use fire and how to use it for practical purposes, they all interpreted that knowledge in the context of their own social order and in the context of the ideas they already had. I mean, we're not blank slates. We are born into families and born into communities. And one of the most to me, useful interpretations of what's going on in the U.S. now is that, in fact, we do have different cultures within the overall American culture. And, for those of you who are interested, I recommend David Halkett Fisher's Albion Seed, where he talks about 4 primary founding cultures in America. The Puritans, the Quakers, the landed gentry, and the borderers. The Scotch-Irish that came originally from the border between Scotland and England, and then went to Ireland, and then came here. And you can interpret voting patterns according to these divisions, and there's been an amazing amount of continuity in that in the past 200 years. And then Colin Woodard, who's another historian, has interpreted, this same kind of cultural political model, but elaborated on different groups, and he talks about the 11 different political cultures in the U.S. But he also converges with Halkett Fisher on the importance of the borderers and the Puritans and the Quakers and the landed gentry. So, but what's been happening lately is that because of our technology, or because our technology lets us listen to the people that we already agree with. I mean, those divisions seem to have been exacerbated lately rather than minimized. We seem to be growing apart rather than together. But and there is a tendency that a lot of us have to demonize the borderers, the people that support Trump, and the view of extreme individualism that goes with that, because that is very different from the more communitarian views of the Puritans and the Quakers. And Hawkett Fisher argues it's not so much, genealogical that causes these things. It's when you found a community, what happens over time as other people come into the community and integrate into it, so that you don't have to be of Scotch, Irish lineage in order to have the political beliefs that a borderer has. I'm from Pittsburgh, and so Appalachia is largely borderer territory, and Pittsburgh is part of Appalachia, although not that many admit it. But and if you look, though, at the voting patterns, the city is blue but in a sea of red. There is that kind of and I know people. One of the things that is characteristic of Appalachia, people live in haulers, and people are somewhat reluctant to go between haulers. And, just like the people in the story was like, well, you're not from here, I won't listen to you. I ran in the same kind of problem when I was doing a site visit in eastern Kentucky, and people said to us, well, if you have a clinic in one hauler, the people in the other haulers aren't going to come to it. And I have a cousin who grew up in Pittsburgh, and she does not like to cross the rivers. And I know other people in Pittsburgh like that. They really do like, some people, they do really stick in their own haulers. So these patterns are, I think, they do have consequences. But, one thing that the story, makes me think about is that most of the time, these kinds of patterns are unconscious. They are embodied. People don't talk about them. We're not talking about identity politics here. We are talking about culture as a system of practices. And the story, the storyteller takes liberties, right? He's making explicit the things that aren't often explicit, and that it can take us a long time to bring up into awareness. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind. Have any of you ever run into situations where that kind of difference, a cultural difference, where you've realized that that's operating after a while, but it didn't hit you, to begin with? It happens in families, when you marry across cultural lines, or you may not even realize that, cultural lines don't have to be the same as ethnic lines. You may marry into a family that does have a different way of thinking about things or different customs as your own, but especially if it doesn't correspond to, say, an explicit religious difference or ethnic difference, sometimes people don't become aware of them until they start fighting over, like how to scold the children.
I don't know whether careful. I don't know whether the book talks about this or whether you've thought about this, but America, I like to talk about the darkening of America, and I don't mean darkening in a negative way, like things are getting awful. I mean that our soon there will be more people of color in this country than there are people of non-color or so-called non-color. And I think that people of color bring with them, having come from many of them elsewhere, not all, certainly not all. Most blacks now in this country have been born and grown up here many generations. but Hispanics, Asians, South Asians are all people of color, and bring with them different cultural traditions. So how are all these different cultural traditions related to what I call the darkening of America going to affect these four primary groups that you referred to, and decisions and so forth?
Well, yeah, as I said, one of how the color of your skin or even your immediate lineage, it's how you adapt to the community that you come into. And in fact, some of the time, I think that is what people are disagreeing about. How do you disagree, and whose ways of disagreeing do you follow? And but I think it is important to realize that it's not really about. I mean, we tend to, because it's part of some of the founding cultures from England. It's part of their heritage to essentialize these things, right? To say that it is about skin and genealogy, when at root it's about learning, and what it means to learn in a community, to learn from the people that you socially relate to. And so that is something that's subject to change and adaptation. It's not immutable.
I'm sorry. And all these, I think this is a very positive thing, this darkening of America. And I think it's got to be having an effect on us, that we have to be changing, we, the traditional cultures. There are some wonderful new holidays, new celebrations, new ways of looking at life, family.
Yeah, new ways of looking at life. And I think, that's important, that it's not, I mean, I've been through, discussions about like what people call the chomp and stomp models of celebrating ethnic difference. Meaning, food and dance, which are great. And I mean, I like both food and dance, but you're right. I mean, there's inherent, and that's part of what the center is about, right? That, I mean, here we're learning a tradition that came from India into China and then into Japan and then here, right? And every place where that tradition went added on to it and made it deeper and richer, and we're doing that too. So, as I said, this learning in community, that's, the power, right, and new ways of perceiving the world. So this is a Javanese scarf, and it's actually borrowed. I need to return it at some point. But I studied Javanese dance when I was in college, and I don't know, as far as customs and practices, I think, it did make a difference in the way I move. And I studied Bharatanatyam also. I mean, like this fire, that's a mudra from Bharatanatyam, from classical South Indian dance. And that is the way you do fire. I think I did this for priests. That's that's not Indian, that's Jewish, actually. And that is what the Kohanim do during the blessing, and yeah, that is where "Live Long and Prosper" came from, right? Yeah, I mean, Nimoy was Jewish, and he put that in there. So and to me, that is one of the values, right, of living in a diverse society, that we can draw from different cultural traditions. And but while still respecting the integrity of the actions and the thinking that they came from, just like when musicians blend different musical traditions, it tends to work better if you have a deeper understanding of the traditions that you're blending, right, rather than just sort of trying to decompose everything into elements and stick them together. And maybe that is one of the challenges of witnessing, is to look at holes at the way the way we think and the way we act, the way it fits together, or sometimes doesn't. And not just to be, one of the things that I think, is important about Zen training is not to be blinded by words, and to be able to meditate and to get that distance from the word and the thing, and not to essentialize and say, well, X is like that because his skin is dark and because we label him, in a particular way. But instead to witness, and to witness the variety of ways of viewing the world and how it gets enacted in community.
When I was working, I was a bilingual teacher, and the first school that I taught in when I came back to Chicago was in Pilsen. And it was also the time when local school councils started, and they were going to, pick the principal and be very involved in the running of the school. And this was something new. So one of my close friends wound up being one of the teacher representatives, and so most of the people on the council were Hispanics, because it was a Hispanic school. And so they were having a meeting, and the meetings were scheduled like once a month, and one of the people had not shown up, and she then called to say that she had just had a car accident. And so immediately all the people said, we're going to cancel our meeting and we're going to go out and help her. And my friend was I don't want to say she was appalled, but she really was surprised and didn't think it was apropos to cancel this very formal meeting. And I said, well, that's what people do. People are more important than things or a meeting. Mm-hmm.
Maybe you've heard about what's sometimes called the Latino paradox around infant mortality, that when for instance, Mexican-American families emigrate into the U.S., actually infant mortality gets worse the longer the family's been here. Because I think, because of cooperative practices like what you're talking about, because there is value to having extended families and having people help each other. And as people, become more adapted to the more mainstream model of nuclear families here, something gets lost. So, and you can see it in the infant mortality indicators. Yeah. So, right. So sometimes these things that we think of as not concrete, do have very concrete effects. And there's been research on how teams make decisions, and Scott Page at the University of Michigan. So he's talked about the importance of cognitive diversity. That when you have team members coming from diverse perspectives, he's actually shown experimentally that the teams end up making better and more effective decisions. Anthropologists argue that cultural diversity does support cognitive diversity. But I think, it only works to our advantage when people are willing to witness and to withhold judgment, and to take the time to observe not just other people but themselves also. And I know, for me, there's this book, Born to Kvetch, which is ostensibly about Yiddish, but it's the best book about Eastern European Jewish culture I've ever read, and I didn't read it until I was over 50. And it really did help me understand my mother, because she was, and but myself as well. So, and I do know where the interruption comes from. I mean, it is a cultural pattern. Yeah. But becoming more aware of it, I mean, I'm more in a position to make choices about it. Well, frankly, sometimes, I'm like, well, my undergrad advisor had a daughter that she used to like to slide down the banisters. They had a 2-story house. And he was scolding her for sliding down the banisters. And she said to him, she was about 9 years old, she said, "But Daddy, it's my culture." So she picked that up. So, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's true. Sometimes you could use it as an excuse, but at any rate, the complaining and the arguing that are part of my cultural tradition, for a long time I didn't see it because it was, it was the fish and water thing. But one of the advantages of living in a multicultural society is that, you have the advantages, and sometimes it's not easy, but, you have the advantages of your own way of viewing the world and your own way of acting, of rubbing up against somebody else's, and that does help you make yourself more aware of your own assumptions, and your own ways of doing things. And I guess I've always maintained that that's a value because it should give you more alternatives for action. And then you still have the question, though, of how to act. And Bernie talks about being responsive and acting from a place of embodiment, and not intellectualizing too much. I guess I tend to feel like the space that reflection gives you, that meditation can support, is important, and that acting from that reflective space has different consequences than blind reaction. And for better, for worse, I guess I do feel like there are some kinds of intellectual discussion or questioning that can help support that, but not if you hold too strongly to thinking that, because you've spent a lot of time like reading or discussing these things, that that you have the quote right answer. I mean, the not knowing to me is a very important antidote to that. And because without not knowing, you can't learn. And learning, one of the reasons I like the Sufi story is because it does show that learning is a social activity. And that there is, there's more than just a parallel between teaching and learning and the process of social change. That teaching and learning are inherently social activities, and that if we see social change more as about learning, as about witnessing together and talking together, and trying forms of talk where as I said, I come from traditions where when people talk together, they talk on top of each other, and they argue with each other, and that can be fun, and I think sometimes at least it can be enlightening. But trying out different modes of talk, I have also found that valuable, and like the council practices, that many of you here have participated in, I think are very valuable as a kind of technology for talking and witnessing together that can get us to a different place and support non-judgmental witnessing and support group learning and group insight.
Excuse me. I was just going to say, I think we're talking a lot about race and cultures and maybe even religions, but even if you take this tradition, there's sectarianism in it. I think if you put 3 people in a room, there's going to be 2 against 1. I think it's just human nature to tribal mentality, to find somebody to be different from somebody else.
Yeah, but who the 2 are might vary, right? And with the same group, it does have the potential to switch.
What I'm saying is, if we get 3 people and they're all of the same culture and they're all of the same height, they're all of the same size, they're all of the same sex, you're still going to get 2 against the wall. I think. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I think it's just human nature, going back millions of years.
Yeah, but that it is how those things build up over time, right? That becomes more powerful, right? So, and whether you have support for divisions that continue, like you have separation, like in the story, between the priests and the people, and if the priests maintain that separation and maintain knowledge that doesn't get shared, then that increases the division, right? And sometimes there's value in division, as we've said, just like when we talk about the value in diversity. I mean, having diverse perspectives does give you resources that you don't get if everybody's homogenous. So, there are different ways of looking at that, right? Pluses and minuses. And for instance, look at the divisions within feminism between people who say, okay, men and women should come to view the world in similar ways, or make an argument something like that, and people say, well, but we should also take advantage of the unique ways that women have of looking at the world because of the way women have been acculturated, because of what they've shared with each other and built up over generations. And some of that is a resource and shouldn't be thrown away. So, so there's different ways of looking at this, relationship between power and knowledge and the value of diversity. But I kind of want to get back to this issue of becoming aware of these things and naming them, because sometimes it can be hard to name them. Especially if you're talking in a context where cultural difference does become something that's to be, quote, managed, as opposed to be something that's valued, and what it means to bring something into awareness and to talk about it, and people do get into situations where, like in the story, the disciples saw distinct patterns, right, in these different communities. Sometimes in our society, when you start naming the patterns, people will say, oh, you're stereotyping, you shouldn't do that. But, we are talking about learning and adaptation. So, there's emergent patterns. There's dependent arising over long periods of time. People do establish common ways of viewing the world and common ways of acting. But, and naming those things isn't, it doesn't have to be essentializing. You don't have to say, well, because we've named these differences, they always have to persist. Just like, I don't always have to interrupt. I can make the choice to participate in a talking circle and only talk when I'm holding the talking piece. So there's, this balance between following ways of thought and action that may be habitual to you, and being able to be open to new ones, and having more choice about it. And I guess I do think awareness is partly about choice, and that gets into that question again about the distinction between awareness and action, and being able to hold both the idea of the oneness, of the unity of all things, and to be able to discern, right, to make distinctions. And when I was thinking about this story, one of the things that came up for me, in my head, is the story of Genesis. My name story. And when Eve bit the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that was about discernment, right? It was about seeing distinctions. And it was a violation of the unity of Eden. And she and Adam were thrust out from Eden. But that's what happens when we're born. We're thrust out of unity into differentiation, into distinctness. And from the larger view of things, from big mind, birth is inseparable from death. Because when you get the distinction, you also get the going back into oneness. And from the big mind point of view, it is all one. And to me, I guess, part of the power of Zen thinking is to be able to hold both those propositions at once. It is, non-Aristotelian logic. It is both and. And I think also when we're talking about issues of cultural diversity and valuing other people's perspectives, even if it's somebody from a red state, looking at the way, for instance, what are their views on individual liberty and freedom, things that we might be able to understand why people value them. Looking at that as in less judgmental ways, but looking also, like it says in the vows, Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to open them. Looking for the openings, looking for the ways that we can adapt to each other, looking for innovation, looking for recombination. To me, that's part of what the Sufi story of fire is about.
Thanks. Good morning. Good morning. And thank you very much for that lovely language that you did this morning through this. That was really lovely. In this story, the part for me that I need to pay attention for me is the idea of the so that. When the disciples say, let's visit the tribes and tell them the truth about fire making so that they will be educated and their lives can be better. And I remember as a young girl, I was with my father, and we were driving, and I saw a person on the street, and I made the comment, something of the nature of, oh, that's so unfortunate, or oh, how bad, or just something. And he said to me, oh, I didn't know that you knew that person. And I said, well, I don't know that person. And he said, well, you seem to, because you've decided that they're unhappy. And, you know, something about this conversation came up. I was quite young, and he tried to help me understand what was happening for me, that I needed to decide that what I saw in this person was an unhappy thing, and why I had to make myself comfortable in having that land somewhere. And I think it's interesting in this story that in all of the different visitations that were made, the master never approached anyone. I picture the master with his disciples like kids running around, because the master told the disciples at the end of the story what he could have said in the beginning. But he was allowing them to go witness. He was allowing them to go see and learn for themselves. And I think the idea for me is that, you know, what is my so that? Am I really kind of going into the world and in community with this altruistic kind of thing? You know, not I want to be altruistic, but to really take the time before I go and trespass and impose my betterness onto someone else's life. Am I doing it because I want to be part of community? Am I doing it because it's comfortable just to land in other people's opinions and just tell myself, well, it's for the good? So in this story, the so that is very critical, because to me this is a story about ego and what it means to be meditating and in the world in a way where I don't want to harm. Even if I don't mean to, I know that I'm capable of it. If I lead with me, I'm going to harm somewhere along the line. So I may just have to wait before I go and make the world better. And I think for me, you know, the origin of my name, you know, biblically Yaakov and Jacob is like truth, and, you know, the supplanter and going up under and putting roots, and you know, that for me can be very dangerous, because I will decide when people need my help, and I won't discern when I've been asked, and I won't stop and say, how can I help you? I'll just be like, I'm gonna educate you and make you better, and I lose out. Because I want to go into the world and, you know, that whole thing, bless them, change me, but I also want to be okay with me. I want to be aware, like you're saying, so that I can just kind of, I can go around and not lose the opportunity for me to blossom, and then take it on, you know. Because I, too, like many people, just intergenerationally, I've been blessed and cursed in so many ways. And I just love how I don't have to interrupt. That's amazing. I didn't know that I didn't have to interrupt people. I think that's pretty great. So thanks for that information from my husband.
Yeah, well, and in fact, of course, in marriages, that does often come up, yeah. I know I was talking about, Deborah Tannen's a linguist who's talked about differences in cultural patterns of communication, and I was talking about that once to a class of people, and this woman came up, and she'd married into a Orthodox Jewish family, and she was from I think a Cajun Canadian background, and yeah, and she was saying that she found her spouse's family pretty overwhelming and at first, and didn't really know what was going on, but yeah, that's a what, and that I mean, I think you know, the conundrum and the difficult line to walk, though, when we're talking about social action, is I mean, there's also a danger of feeling like you can't do anything, right? That you're just witnessing, and that you don't have the right to enter into community. But if you see what you're doing in terms of social action as entering into community and creating community together, rather than, you know, telling somebody what to do, I think the consequences can be very different. I mean, you know, when I was in Micronesia, right, you always, and you know, a lot of other places in the world, especially what's called the third or the developing world, you know, you hear these stories about the Peace Corps, right? I mean, when I was on some of the atolls in Micronesia, people were saying, oh, you know, because the way of, they use the Japanese word benjo for the latrines, right? And people put latrines out over the lagoon, and so you crap and you watch the fish eat it, and but the thing is, the lagoon, it's like a big toilet bowl. The tides flush it twice a day, And so that when the Peace Corps came in, though, they thought, oh, that's nasty. And they told people to go build latrines on the land. But on an atoll, that's like really bad, because what happens is the crap, atolls have this freshwater lens, right? Because fresh water is lighter than salt water. So the fresh water sits on top of the salt water. So people traditionally dug shallow wells, because then you just get the fresh water. But if you dig latrines and you dig them deep enough, then the crap sort of goes and floats on that interface between, the fresh water and salt water, and it'll poison the whole island. So, I mean, people knew what they were doing. There's lots of stories about that. And anyway, before we close, I want to, I guess, beg your indulgence for a minute, and that's when I was dancing with the Thai group, one of the things they always told us before we started to dance was to remember the ancestors. And I've talked about some of the teachers here. I mentioned Bernie Glassman, and I should mention Ahmed El Badawi, whom is this story is attributed to, who died in 1276, which I think is a meaningful reminder that that older sources of wisdom, such as the wisdom we get here, are something to be treasured and something to be valued. And while in the scientific citation canons, people are told, you just need to cite stuff in the last 5 years, I think, when it comes to the technology of human wisdom and human interaction, I think we need to go back a lot further. Anyway, for me, January 27th is an anniversary of sorts. I know I've talked sometimes about when I first read Gregory Bateson's Steps to an Ecology of Mind and what difference that made and how my brain's wired. But I only read that book because I read a book that we were assigned in English class, S.I. Hayakawa's Language and Thought and Action. And I read that 47 years ago today. All right, so, I mean, I remember because it was, it was the first time I was intellectually passionate about anything, and it was the first time, people. I was afraid of speaking in public before, and then after that, people couldn't shut me up. I mean, you can look at my 9th grade yearbook. Somebody wrote in there, if you say one more word about Hayakawa, I'll kill you. But I did want to, before I close, a biography of him came out a couple of years ago and called him an enigmatic figure, and I think his life does show some of the conundrums of thought and language and action. He went from being a Cold War liberal to a Republican senator and became known for pulling out the wires to the loudspeakers in the student strikes that were going on in 1968 when he was president of San Francisco State. But he also wrote very powerfully about language and the social world. And one of the things he talked about was what he called cultural lag, that our material technologies have increased faster and more effectively than our social technologies, which is one of the reasons why I value things like the talking circle. I mean, to me, that's part of a social technology, and we need to value those as much as we value, like the fusion reactor that my brother's working on. So, whatever the decisions that Hayakawa made, what he wrote, I think, has been powerful for me and a lot of other people. And, he talked about the map not being the territory, which he got from Korzybski. And it's because of him that I am able to understand some of the things that we've been talking about here in the Zen Center, that I got some practice at a fairly early age in creating that separation between language, between labels and what we're labeling. So I just want to close with that, with being mindful of both the power of language and the dangers of thinking that our language and the ways that we're speaking are the only right way. And so I conclude with not knowing.